Canadian weather is famously hard on vehicles, but also on those who have to work on them. This here is my personal 1983 American Motors Eagle wagon. Built in Brampton, this particular car has had a pretty easy life. It lived in southern British Columbia. Down there in Okanagan, without the usual salt, this thing has survived with far less rust than most cars of this vintage. Still though, sometimes you run into a nut or bolt that's gonna take some heat. If you're not familiar, heating nuts and bolts is really important because it basically expands the metal just that bit that it breaks off all of those bonds where the rust has actually started to cement two parts together. Normally we would do that with a little torch. Now, if you're in a big proper shop, you'll generally have an oxy-acetylene torch on hand. These things are really powerful. They can run up to about 2,500 degrees Celsius and they will bring a lot of heat really quickly. They also can be a little bit dangerous. If you've heard the old adage, A before O or up you go, that's acetylene before oxygen or else it explodes, well, that's a bit of what you're dealing with there. For those of us at home who can't necessarily afford all of that though, we would often rely on torches. Now, you can get a little propane, which will run just under 2,000 Celsius, or something like this MAP gas, which runs a little over 2,000 Celsius. These do the trick, although usually they take a little while to actually get there. This here though, is a fun little bit of the future because we're now at a point where some industrial technologies are being scaled down to be packaged, manageable, and affordable for the everyday DIYer. This here is one of them. It's an induction heater. It's distributed by a company called Vevor. You've probably seen this name proliferating quite extensively of late on a lot of white label products. In this case, it's a 1,000-watt induction heater. Now, the operating principle here is pretty neat. This thing uses its electromagnetic field that's just from an alternating electric current surrounding it through that metal coil to excite the electrons within the individual atoms in that conductive metal. What that means is that similar to your microwave at home and the way that it excites all of the water molecules in your food and then heats everything around it, well, this, by exciting those electrons, generates a lot of kinetic energy and that ends up releasing heat. That heat then, of course, expands the metal and makes this thing work. Now, what can you do with that? Well, it's actually more than just fasteners because you can use this to heat larger areas of metal. If you're working on something like brakes and need to free up a really sticky bleed nipple, you could use something like this. Surround the nipple and actually put heat into the caliper metal below. Now, the idea there is that the caliper metal would expand around that stuck nipple and release. And that would save you from what someone had a trouble with here, which is actually a broken off nipple altogether. They ended up having to use an extractor. Not a fun time at all. The theoretical applications go farther too. You could use a flat wound coil and apply it to something like dented metal to heat that and soften it for some paintless dent removal. Going further, there's even hypothetically an application for removing sticky trim or adhesives. By heating the metal below, but not actually warming up the rubbers or whatever else, that can actually help to melt them off. However, that gets into a little bit of a tricky spot because you see, this thing at 1,000 watts is powerful, but it's not powerful enough to heat huge areas of metal. If you're working on something like a trailer hinge, which we encountered just last weekend at home, well, once you're getting to a couple kilos of metal, this simply will not cut it. At that point, you need to be getting into units of several thousand watts. Here though, for little stuff for the DIYer, it makes a lot of sense. Alrighty, so I've got to remove the hub from my AMC Eagle here to do the wheel bearings, and I've run into a large fastener that is rather stuck in a larger casting. I've got to remove the steering arm in this case, and it's not off to a good start. I've tried giving it some electric ugga-duggas like this, but without any motion. So let's see if induction will be enough to heat this honestly rather sizable casting up. So for this job we could use one of the coils and wrap that around the head, but the thing here is that we don't actually want to heat the bolt. If anything, we want the bolt to stay small. We want the metal around it to heat up and expand to free this up. So I'm actually using this big pad surface and I'm going to try to apply it top and bottom to try to soak all of that iron around it. We're starting to see the flash of some of the oils that have been left on the caliper here. That's what the smoke coming off is. And I am starting to feel the radiant heat against my finger. According to the infrared, after that initial hit, we're looking at just under 62 degrees Celsius. So let's keep on it. We have to be mindful here of a duty cycle. In this case, it's 2 minutes on, 5 minutes cooling, and then another 2 minutes of work once it's done that. So I can only do a bit at a time. That can be a little bit troublesome because sometimes you really don't want to lose that heat. This is actually a case, if it doesn't succeed, where I may end up breaking out the torch just to continue on that initial heat. But we'll see what happens. Down here to heat the backside as well. I am mindful that anything this coil or its leads are in proximity to could also pick up some heat, so I'm being attentive to try to keep it away from the lower point just because I don't need to waste energy there. I've also made sure to take rings off because those also will induct heat, and then you end up burning yourself with something that you can't get off your finger very easily. I can see the coil itself is red hot right now, just in a few spots, but it is emitting a notable glow. I'll let that cool. Infrared says we're at 70 degrees underneath and about 120 up top. The tricky thing, of course, is that this initial casting on the steering arm is not really the part the threads are engaged in. They're actually engaged farther back in the spindle itself. So for this next step, I'm actually going to change gears, and I am going to try to heat just the head of that to try to put heat in the bolt in hopes that it makes its way through. Still, expansion and contraction is going to help us. It's just not necessarily the preferred path. I could just go at it with the map torch here as well, but I've still got seals, I've got rubbers around here, and I don't want to deal with the consequences of flame. Just for funsies though, let's put the tool on it and see what happens right now. Alright, a few minutes having passed, we're going to try this coil tip and see what happens if we put the heat straight into the bolt. The unfortunate thing though is that with this time having gone, this has gone from 120 Celsius to 45. So that expansion and contraction cycle may still have some value, but that won't have been hot enough for long enough to likely have given us a whole lot. The smoke now is not coming from the metal, but from the insulation on the coil itself. All of it started to discolor pretty quickly with our initial tests, and I'm really wondering how quickly this is going to become fragile. (120 degrees Celsius around the casting there, 160 degrees in the bolt head. We've got a little motion. But not enough motion. Back to the breaker bar. Oh! It moves! Yes! That's one of my favorite awful sounds. Yay! And I didn't have to use any flame. Oh, I'm quite pleased. All right, so this 3/4 head by about 2-inch bolt has been extracted. It's not the worst, but it's definitely got that visible sign of corrosion on it. This attached to a fair bit of spindle casting, all solid old iron, has actually done better than anticipated, although it did take a while, and it wasn't quite the miracle fix that I think I was necessarily hoping for or that was promised. At 1,000 watts then, it looks like, yes, you can get somewhere with things that won't move under breaker or impact, but it's definitely not commercial. Caliper, rotor, steering arm, and drive axle removed, we now just have a free spinning hub, but now we're going to be able to hear why I have to be in here in the first place, because Wheel bearing should be silent, not like that. So to get the actual hub off for pressing and rebuilding though, I've got yet more fasteners that probably haven't been out for probably 20 to 30 years. So more heat.